Hi, my name is Chuck Howell, and I want to thank the organizers of this conference for the privilege of participating, and I'm very much looking forward to the conversation. I'm going to talk very briefly about the aspects of the right to know for AI systems that occur left of algorithm. So first, I just want to demonstrate my firm grasp of the obvious. The reason this conference is so important is that AI is being introduced into consequential, complex socio-technical systems. I'll try and parse that out just a little bit. By consequential, I simply am noting that AI has gone way past just remarkable demonstrations of superhuman capability in board games or in making movie recommendations. AI is now used in a wide variety of situations where there are really consequential impacts on citizens' lives, both for good or for bad. And so the stakes are very high. Complex just is trying to capture the nuance as distinct from complicated, that these are systems that demonstrate well understood things like emergent behavior. They're subject to feature interaction and they have to worry about subtle coupling. And so these introduce additional challenges to our ability to establish justified confidence in the performance of these systems. Finally, these systems are part of broad end-to-end socio-technical systems. So they are affected by and they affect individual and collective behavior, social constructs, assumptions, policy, et cetera. It's definitely not just what runs on electricity, the model and the data, for example. So I want to pull maybe an illustration of some of the implications of this from the history of cybersecurity. I'm pretty sure no one ever explicitly said this during the development of the internet, but I think it's definitely the case that there came a time when we collectively recognized that the internet had become a critical global infrastructure and very consequential. And yet it wasn't built originally with robustness against deliberate attack in mind. And so what started and has continued to this day is paying a great deal of attention to cybersecurity and in some sense trying to retrofit in to the protocols and underlying infrastructure additional robustness against attack. And I think we'd all agree that it would be better off if we had baked in those concerns from the very start of the internet rather than retroactively trying to fix it. So the term left of algorithm just refers to those aspects of the development of a AI model that are going on well before the actual algorithm is developed. An analogy, this is some work that Miter did on payment fraud. And you clearly always have to identify when a fraudulent payment has been made and try to recover the payment, investigate the fraud. But clearly there is an ROI for moving your focus as well, sort of upstream or to the left, to identify those opportunities to even reduce the opportunity for that fraud to occur, not only to identify it and mitigate it. Similarly, there are things that are required to be given attention long before you've selected data and built an algorithm. So one approach that's frequently used in system design is participatory design, sometimes referred to as know about us without us. I recommend highly some work that's going on at the Partnership for AI in the Public Interest called Methods for Inclusion. And it's looking at adapting and extending tools and techniques for participatory design to address the use of AI in consequential systems. It's not a perfect fit, and so there's a lot of attention being paid to what are the gaps and what do we need to do. But it is an example of a tool that's used to get left of algorithm. This is important for a bunch of obvious reasons, but just to illustrate it with one, this article from Science magazine in October of 2019 investigated a widely used health decision support system developed by a company called Optum. It was developed with the best of purposes in mind to drive down healthcare costs, not by refusing claims or reducing payments, but by finding opportunities to intervene early in patients who were on a trajectory to become much more ill and therefore to be much more expensive to the healthcare system. Type 2 diabetes is a great illustration. If you have full-blown type 2 diabetes, That's a very difficult malady, and you're likely to have a lot of interventions required, which is very expensive. But type 2 diabetes is amenable to intervention if you get to it early enough with diet and exercise and medications, et cetera. So the purpose of this system was to bend the cost curve of healthcare by identifying the best opportunities to reduce costs by intervention. But what it turned out to do was to have, as you can see in this quote from the report, a horrific disparate outcome, not just a minor difference of allocation of resources, but very, very substantial preferential allocation of intervention resources to white patients compared to equally ill Black patients. It was clearly not the intent, but that was the outcome. It had nothing to do, the problem with this system had nothing to do with the data that was selected per se, or the model. It really was the way that the goals of the system were articulated way before data was selected, models were built, left of algorithm, and also that it really fundamentally misunderstood the socio-technical context in which it was going to operate. This quote from a response by Optum really tries to make clear that this was intended to be a cost model, not a closed form, complete automated decision process, but input into the decision process about intervention. But it was nonetheless used in a way that really drove those intervention decisions. The thing that was overlooked was that cost isn't race neutral in the United States with respect to healthcare. Income and access to insurance is correlated with race, and so there are disparities there. And then certain cohorts engage with the health system less than others, in part because of different levels of trust in the health system. And so that's reflected in how much is spent on a patient. And some of that trust or lack thereof is based on history. Some of it's based on individual lived experience. I highly recommend the article Assessing Risk and Automating Racism, an overview in the same issue of Science by a brilliant researcher and writer, Ruha Benjamin. She takes a couple of steps backwards and really lays out the broader social context for this system. So this is why focusing just on the data and the model itself is really going to miss some of the fundamental upstream decisions and not engage some of the required stakeholders. So the last point I really want to make here is talking about the right to know, and focused on stakeholder engagement with a broad definition of stakeholders, including not just the acquirers and the developers and the regulators, but people affected or impacted by the system, who often typically don't have a seat at the table when the decisions are being made. But no one has the capacity to be involved with every consequential system that they encounter. I am very concerned about how well or poorly an MRI works if I'm going to have a surgical procedure, or how well the avionics works in the aircraft that I'm putting my family in. But I don't have the time or the capacity or the capability to really be an informed participant in every aspect of all those different systems. One part of that is the difference between the operator versus other kinds of stakeholders. The pilot is an operator. My family and I are stakeholders. And there's just no time or capacity to constantly engage with every system and exercise our right to know. So typically what we do is identify proxies that represent various stakeholder interests, and in what is hopefully a transparent social construct that we can end up having confidence in. And we insist that those proxies do have access to what they need to know in order to make informed decisions about whether or not confidence can be justified. Now, clearly, these systems don't always work. There are lots of examples where stakeholders weren't even included at the table. There are other examples where it just failed, where it didn't work right. And that's always going to be the case. But despite the fact that there's much work to be done, I think that's the framework in which we have to think about the right to know. It's not always just about explainable MRIs or explainable avionics. It's about the broader social constructs that give us justified confidence. And again, I keep recommending things to read for very, very busy people, but this paper that I reference at the bottom of this slide expresses this whole concept much more eloquently than I possibly could. So I highly recommend that. So I want to wrap up. Thank you very much for your time and attention and for the opportunity to discuss this topic. And I would really appreciate anybody who wants to reach out. I'd love to continue this discussion. And that's my email address and my LinkedIn account. So thank you again.